I'm going to refer to a whole range of just images as I talk, in a way a trick to keep you awake as I somewhat drone on and put you to sleep, right? Maybe two even prefatory remarks, because I've got some real prefatory remarks over here. The one is to say that coming out of my institute, a book was published just 2 weeks ago by Duke University Press by a group of researchers from the University of California called Speculate This, under an authorship by which they designate themselves anonymous, though I know who they are. Right? I want to suggest that what I'm going to be doing is a version of speculation, and I'm going to violate every one of Cullen's challenges, but then I'm not a scientist, I'm a philosopher, so I guess I could do that, right? The other is the question. I've tried to somewhat take the notion of affect seriously in the title of the workshop, and the very interesting remarks this morning by Andrew. My very, very good colleague and close friend, Akbar Abbas, who's at the University of California, Irvine now, a media and film scholar, usually talks of affect as those sorts of emotive or emotional states which cannot or have not yet been named, right? And there's a way in which you were speaking about the not yet naming of this condition of racial affect. There are aspects of that that are laced throughout this. So environmental migration has become an increasingly significant force in the movement of people from more resource-challenged to more economically privileged societies in the past few decades. As the planet has warmed and environmental events have become more dramatic, the threat to already fragile lived environments has grown exponentially. And while climatologically induced migration is not new, the Oklahoma Dust Bowl that was referred to earlier today, more people are displaced as a consequence by storms, rising sea levels, earthquake-induced tsunamis, tornadoes and other weather-related or weather-exacerbating events. I mean, tsunamis being a case in point of the latter. And more consequently have moved as economic life has become challenged, living conditions less amenable, life prospects increasingly in question. Living in a critical condition, and I mean both meanings by that term, living in a critical condition has proliferated from the coastlines of Bali to downtown Manhattan, and across various other kinds of places and spaces. You might say from Ethiopia and Darfur to the dust plains north of Beijing, and so on and so forth. So now some real prefatory observations. First, all environmental disasters are the complex product of what, following the likes of Haraway and Latour, we want to call nature culture, no hyphen, right? Most have tended overwhelmingly to think of environmental disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, droughts, famines, floods, etc., as naturally caused, with nature acting on humans, whose agency is at most that of victims or victims reacting to the unpredictable contingencies of such natural events. But at the least, the experience of disaster very much implicates human beings. And more deeply, the impacts, if not a considerable and growing feature of the causes of most all environmental disasters, are a function of what you might call human contribution. This is the Outer Banks of North Carolina, right? And the house is actually built in the sea, right? So, when one talks about the way in which nature, culture come together, in disastrous events like this, one has the implication of human agency. There is no environmental disaster, least of all those a product of climate change, in which human agency, oversight, blinkers, arrogance, greed, carelessness, and ignorance are not centrally implicated, as a case in point. Second, risk emerges in relation to and helps to produce a specific notion of society, as Durham has been demonstrating so compellingly of late. He's a PhD student of mine who's writing a really, really interesting account of the neoliberalizing of race. With the emergence of the welfare state, vested as it was in the secularization of the pastoral, of the state as caretaker, risk in the face of wars and natural disasters is taken up as a social responsibility, as that collectively shared by ensuring that state resources would alleviate the effects more or less evenly across the population, where the population was very contained and well-defined, right? Indeed, racially contained and well-defined. Franklin Delano Roosevelt articulated the conception, as well as anyone, in putting it to Congress, US Congress, in the lead-up to passage of the Social Security Act of 1934, that this would, quote, safeguard against the misfortunes which cannot be wholly eliminated in this man-made world of ours. So I'm calling the sense of the welfare state the caretaker state, where the state sees as its function and disposition to provide that kind of safety net, that caretaking for those who count, importantly, as members of the social. The welfare state would spread the risk, individually and socially, across its members who would bear the cost collectively. As a key principle of classic liberalism, is to treat rational agents equally, care in principle would not stop at the border, whether a family or society thought of as extended kin, as the bonds of the familial and the extended familiar. While realpolitik and pragmatics kicked in to curtail in its application the reach of the abstract principle, the Cold War, you could say, froze out heated critics, communist, socialists, and other racially conceived moochers. Migrants fleeing repression or with a moral claim on Western societies began showing up in the metropole post-1945, at least. Natural disasters were still, well, you could say natural, at least as conceived and comprehended. That meant, to a degree, collective responsibility in caring for the impacted, which included reaching out to and ultimately welcoming in the stranger, at least to some degree. This began to change fairly dramatically as they expressed social commitment from roughly the 1980s onwards, or 1970s onwards. Obviously the threads of the emergence in the late 70s and 80s run much earlier, as Foucault has pointed out, right? But you see here the beginning of the attack on what gets characterized as the welfare state. Collective responsibility increasingly gave way to the individualization of self-caring. Grover Norquist, right, this infamous character in American political life, who says, my goal is to cut government down so I could drown it in a bathtub, right? And he's quite literal about that. Right, the very little, other than the security apparatus of the state, is designed to be left in place as a consequence. One increasingly found oneself bowling alone, expected more and more to self-insure. Caretaking became the cause of private groups, from religious charities to costly bought care. Insurance companies want us to think of them as our best friends. TV ads in the US in particular make this sensibility absolutely explicit. So there's a sense of the state now as the super nanny state, right? As soon as it no longer has as its object of caretaking, right, the well-delineated white community, right, it comes under attack. So I want to say that the attack, in part at least, is racially motivated, right? The threat of race spells out the argument in some detail. Those unable to afford the coverage and purchase support are left largely to fend for themselves, dependent less on social welfare than on charitable, mainly religious handouts. For example, Republicans recently, but you find this in a whole range of societies, including the one I'm standing in. In the US context, Republicans, at least to begin with, refuse even to extend disaster relief to communities in the wake of Katrina, in the wake of Sandy, and so on, and repeated so-called natural disasters. Social security is increasingly pressured to give way to private self-investment. You can compare, in this instance, and I'm sort of telescoping examples over here, Empire Windrush. I mean, we usually refer to the Windrush as a Windrush. I mean, it's interesting that its full name is the Empire Windrush, right? Bringing people in, right? Under quite collective and ordered sets of consideration, whatever you think of it, with a more contemporary modality of migrating practices that we see today that are implicated in the shift, I want to suggest, from the so-called caretaking state to the so-called, what I'm calling traffic ops state, right? That is a state related to neoliberalism. If there's still such a thing as society, it applies only to those already inside its orbit, and then subject more and more to the citadel of securitization than to social welfare. The rest, as a securitizing state would have it, are barbarians at or already inside the gate. Third, historically, migration has long traveled across land and water, often in combination. I mean, here's a version of migrating across land. This is across Mexico, right, where the well-known now example of youth climbing aboard trains in order to get to the US border, right, traversing pretty much the length of the state of Mexico. Right? The sea connects land to land, placing both lands in relation to each other, but also sea to sea, as passageway, as medium, less noticed as substance in and of itself, as life form or forms and life source or sources, cultivating its own general and locationally specific habitats. So just to get a sense of the way in which seas flow or don't flow into each other. Travel and traversal, migration itself, are made possible by virtue of the fact that the Atlantic, the Indian, and the Pacific flow into each other. The Atlantic into the Mediterranean, North and Baltic seas. The China and Japan seas into the Pacific. The various Indonesian seas into the Indian Ocean, and so on and on. It follows, quite obviously, that the boundary lines articulated in the name of these waterways are human artifices, shaping the connecting flows. Seas, it might be said, connect worlds otherwise divided by geographies and politics, put them in play, tend to undercut, if not altogether to undo, nations and states, cultures disposed to guard their presumed homogeneity. The sea thus, and this is just one example, right? The sea thus is a key source of intense heterogenizing and hybridization, of mixture and métissage, the carrier in its flows of pollutants, material and cultural, of bodies, ecological and political, conflicting and consorting. Air comes to the story obviously late in the game and remains the least dramatic and least noticed mode of migration even now. Perhaps because so many fly today as a matter of course, we attend to air-mediated migration only when security is compromised or violated. But the paperless, those lacking the required credentials, would have a better shot entering their state destination of choice or imagination by sea or land where possible than by funneling surveillance of airports. Airports are much more surveyed than most other destination possibilities. Seawater, in any case, comprises more than 2/3 of the Earth's surface and creeping upwards annually. That said, the more or less central role of the sea, both in dramatic aspects of climatic conditions and in migration's traversals, make it a key intersecting factor in thinking about the relation between environmental or climatic transformation and the impacts of major movements of people globally. So I'm going to concentrate my focus in what follows largely, though not exclusively, on the agencies of the sea in this note of issues. And I'm going to use sea and ocean interchangeably just for shorthand. The sea, you could say, by nature, bounds but intrudes upon the landed, intimating that boundaries and borders are blurred edges, even as they are materialized resistances to those blurrings. Tsunamis are the most violent intrusions. Though hurricanes, I mean, it's really quite dramatic. Though hurricanes, perhaps less like tornadoes, cyclones, come off the sea too, gathering strength from as they cross the ocean, pulling up water and becoming faster, more furious, the warmer the water gathered up. But think also of the chaos and conditional concern caused by mist, rust, sea breeze at the coastline. This suggests that the sea deeply shapes our social and even scientific imaginaries. You think of waves of history, of electricity, of nausea, of a military campaign, currents of electricity and of culture, seasons, whale of a good time, sea of love or nausea came over me, a sea of people, capitalist sharks, sea monsters. I mean, one can go on and on and on in these metaphorical kinds of ways, and they traverse sort of cultural reference points, right? I mean, you know, from Japan and China to the Nordic areas. In all of this, then, we tend to think of the sea as a surface, a medium of movement, and perhaps only secondarily as causal agent. But the sea is a key moving agent as much in climatic conditions as in migrating forces. For one, constituting such a large proportion of the planet's surface and volume, seas serve as a key hinge in the rising volatility and eventful effects associated with climate change. And so the way in which currents sort of flow betwixt and between. But as the above slides suggest, it also shapes our social imaginaries at the interface of nature-culture. Storms emanate from low-pressure systems, gathering volume, speed, and power across the vast stretches of water they traverse. As the planet has warmed, nearly 1 degree centigrade Celsius, nearly 1 degree Celsius in the last century, 2/3 of that since 1980. Sea temperatures have heated up as well, by up to a couple of degrees. Hence, of course, the melting ice caps that people have referred to today. Storms accordingly are taking up warmer water off the sea surface, enlarging their reach and deepening their power and volatility as colder, higher air comes into contact with warmer, lower air spiraling off the sea. Winds are stronger, more readily reaching hurricane strength or cyclonic strength. Stormy seas achieving wave heights hitherto beyond experience. Storms becoming more frequent and violent, whipping densely populated shorelines. When last the planet's carbon levels approached these levels that they currently are today in the Pleistocene, seas were 17 feet, what's that, about 5 meters, right? Higher than they are today. So this is post the Sandy storm on the northeast coast of the US. This is along the Long Island shore, right? So all of this, of course, is landed and was pretty much wiped out by Sandy. And then sort of likewise, this kind of image. Hurricane Sandy's storm surge in the mid-northeast US last fall averaged 6 to 11 feet. That's about 3 to 4 meters. And in some neighborhoods reached 14 feet. This was enough to wipe out 3 to 5 blocks of beachfront property and flooded as much as a mile north of Manhattan's southern tip, right? I mean, pretty much the whole of South Manhattan was underwater at the time. Storm surges recede, and while sea levels rise and fall as a matter of course over time, the El Nino effect in 1997-98 and it added 10 millimeters, while in 2007, as a consequence as well, it fell by 5 millimeters. Sea levels rose 6 centimeters in the 19th century, 19 centimeters in the 20th century, and the rate is accelerating at between 1 and 2 feet, almost half a meter, over 2 centuries. So a 17-foot rise, a 5-meter rise, will be super slow, not least in digital time today, and will show far slower effects with much larger permanent impacts. I mean, you know, something like the Maldives is threatened as a constant over a long time. This is what the Maldives and other island and low-lying nations are fearing. The Dutch, you could say, are in half denial, half retro-engineering mode at this point. Slow devastation, to twist Rob Nixon's characterization. I sometimes joke with my colleagues that the California coastline will end up being closer to the Arizona border, horror upon horror, than it is to where it is today, if things keep going in this way. Just to join the melancholia to future projections, estimates are that this century global surface temperatures will increase 1.1 to 2.9 degrees Celsius for low emissions and 2.4 to 6.4 degrees Celsius for high emissions. The consensus is that anything over 2 degrees Celsius increase will exhibit increasingly devastating impact. So, I mean, the projections going out are quite dramatic. To bring this closer to our prevailing concerns with racial implications here today, a recent report predicted the top 20 cities in the developing world with the greatest number of inhabitants likely to be most largely affected by rising sea levels and storm surge, assuming a modest 1 meter surge as a result of a 1 in 100 year storm intensity, which is actually increasingly frequent. The US East Coast, on average, over the last something like 10 years, has averaged something like 4 heightened storms a year. In the last year, there were 12, right? So, I mean, you begin to see the kind of dramatic impact of all of this. So these are the top 20 by population of those most likely to be affected by this increase. And there's something quite revealing about this list when we start to think of it in racial terms. As tragic as the situation we're immediately facing the likes of the Maldives, the proverbial canary in the coal mine, the potential disruption and devastation to the vast numbers across a global and globally networked population defies the imagination, the day after tomorrow notwithstanding. Note that, but for Rio at number 19, every one of these cities is in Africa, North Africa, or Asia, South Asia. They all include densely populated areas of overwhelmingly diverse people, poor, and of color. So any good Gary Becker-inspired rational choice theorist, I'm not saying I'm one, right? This is just a speculation, as I'm putting it, would conclude that if one were going to and could disrupt one's own life and move from these threatened lower to higher ground living environments, one might as well do it all at once and get to where resources and the chance to take a reasonable living, to make a reasonable living, are more readily available, if not sewn into the cultural expectation. Today, this may as much be Shenzhen or Australia, Hong Kong or Singapore, Brazil, maybe not Rio, given this, and Chile as North America or Europe. Flush with the spirit of our time, I too will transform myself into Foucault's neoliberal man of enterprise. As Giovanni Bettini earlier today put it, this morning, the successful climate migrant is projected to be a good entrepreneur herself in these terms. Given that living in a critical condition for so long requires that one become resourceful, simply as a matter of survival, one, you could say, has Hegel's logic of resourcefulness on one side. The decadent privileged of the global north and the global north in the south, beware. Securitization, I'm obviously referring to Hegel's master-slave dialectic, right? Securitization entangled with post-colonial melancholia is indeed a potentially volatile and ultimately, you could say, futile mix. But then, in the age of the end of history, you could ask, who's paying any attention? Anyway, I'll come back to this notion of melancholia at the end. While coastline living has been attracted to the affording for its beauty and recreational draw, until relatively recently, you could say, seaside living had an artisanal and unskilled working culture long associated with it. It has also pulled or lured in those with little, if any, means because of the opportunities more likely or seem to be more likely available. Coastlines likely have any number of ports, funneling goods and services into narrowed corridors, offering opportunities perhaps not available elsewhere. Besides the activities associated directly with ports, industries often concentrate close at hand to diminish delivery costs. Ports then are ready stepping stones to elsewhere where imagined living is appealing or more appealing. And coastlines offer a source of cheap and nutritious, if increasingly threatened, food supply, less available perhaps at a distance from the sea. So coastlines pull migrants, internal and external, into their orbit. at once exacerbating conditions, further threatening fragile habitats, pressuring seafood supplies. Migrants here may be prompted in the more traditional sense of facing few, if any, work opportunities locally, by turning rural into semi-urban or urban, or industrializing construction projects, sending associated land values soaring, by redesigning areas for other purposes, such as the damming of the Yangtze River, the dam which displaced something like nearly 1.5 million people. By the aridization of land, or by disasters such as earthquakes, tornadoes, floods, mudslides, droughts, diseases, wars, and the like. The large-scale climatological shifts are deeply entangled with environmental and so human, social, political, economic, and cultural forces. Ports have long been crossroads of hybrid, rebellious, transgressive, and mobile people, departing and arriving, and servicing the departing and the new arrivals. It is as if the sea-ness of the sea is nothing but the interacting and intersecting sum of these marginalizations, these representations of its edges, surfaces, boundaries, which may have to do with why we so largely ignore the impact of human pollutants on the very sea about which we have so rich a fantasy life. In the focus on the margins and surfaces, the sea, as Mick Tausig has commented, is readily turned into a site of copious and capacious fantastical investment. It, or they really, are sites, suppositories, and you could say substances of fantasy. Much of the cultural production of the sea is predicated in each instance around the specificity of the particular seaside with which the cultural producer is familiar. Think of Dylan Thomas or John Mansfield and so on. I must go down to the sea today and so on. Or Dylan Thomas's characterization under Milquin. And there's a tendency to naturalize, in a sense, as universal from that local particularized site. The visible coastline is the border of our perceivable comforts, beyond which we project fear and foreignness. The classic Japanese way perhaps reaches more broadly for a kind of universalization, understandably perhaps given the island formation. Kim Stanley Robinson exceptionally takes up seriously the sea's globalizing relationalities and relationalizing globalities with all their attendant violences. I think you have the years of rice and salt, which is a marvelous kind of counter-history. Not terribly well written, but I mean, he's not a great writer in that sense, right? But marvelous in sort of projecting counter-futures and so on. Amitav Ghosh is another, in a more historically specific set of contexts, as to Michael and Datye, both migrants, the latter two as they are. These three so race into the stories they convey, in which the sea constitutes a combining, attracting and repelling substance, an agent, an historical actor. The sea here, beyond the coastline and surface, the seeable and more or less knowable, becomes increasingly the unknown, the opaque, the dark, the threat, the kind of representation of the threat of monstrosity built into this in various ways. So I'll come to this slide. The racial of the natural world and the bearer, the bringer, the transporter of the racial, of the outsider, the stranger, the strange, the necessarily unbelonging, the naturally culturalized and the culturally naturalized. As the racial of nature, as culturally naturalized in culture, the sea's other side, its underside, represents all the built-up fears of those racially characterized from the not here, monsters from elsewhere, shadows from places unknown and threatening in their unknowability. Those from beyond the sea, from out of the sea, embody the fears and threats of the unknown. I mean, even something like Amitav Ghosh's River of Smoke, right? I mean, characterizes the way in which, right, the known becomes the unknown, right? In the creation of the foreignness, even of the familiar, so to speak. I mean, a very interesting dialectic taking place in that account. Those from beyond the sea, from out of the sea, embody the fears and threats of the unknown. Mary Douglas's unclean and uncouth. They are, from the viewpoint of the dominating host, prehistoric, transformable, if only to the extent they leave behind their quote, natural or birthright culture, shed it as they dry out, washing away their legacy condition, if they can in the final analysis. Some do, some cannot. The tension exactly between presumptions of racial naturalism and racial historicism. I mean, my distinction between racial naturalism and historicism is between the natural inevitability claim, right? The natural inevitability of inferiority on the one hand, which is naturalism, and racial historicism, which is the historical immaturity claim. So the naturalized can't be educated, right, ever. The historically immature, as in John Stuart Mill, can. So the one is Carlyle, right, you might say in that debate, and the other's Mill. The sea has always signified in terms of the dialectics of surface and depth, until the technologies of submersion began to alter the imaginative disposition towards the sea after the 1930s. Depth tended to represent the unknown, threat, mystery, the dangers of monsters. The surface was considered merely mode of delivery, more easily tamed or at least predicted and negotiated. One could actually see the perils, sorry, that was the slide I wanted. One could actually see the perils before one. With the technological thrust of World War II and its aftermath, submarine technology, sensors, telecommunications, cables, etc., the secrets of the deep started to give way bit by bit, the dangers more calculable, transforming uncertainties and their imaginaries into calculable risks. More recently, the genetic profile of the sea is increasingly being fathomed, its microbial makeup mapped, Stefan Heimrich, exactly. We have come to know more and more of the sea in all its depth. But as depth became more manageable, surface, you could say, became increasingly unpredictable, bringing strangers, waves of migration and rivers of blood, boatloads of pirates and containers of pirated goods, heightened weather patterns and storm surges. So there's a kind of inversion of that historical logic at work. The hitherto hidden from view became more transparent, noble. The hitherto hidden from view became more transparent, noble. The more readily visible became more dangerous, more invasive. The unkempt hordes, the harder to grasp and control, and so all the more threatening, imaginatively as materially. Alien ocean, to use Heimreich's pressing notion for a different, if related, context. Colonial migration at its height tended to be north to south and east to west. The former colonial administrators, henchmen, military forces, entrepreneurs in search of raw materials, those fleeing Europe's repressions, Europe's social dregs exported to the outlying netherworld or seeking opportunities in new worlds. The latter were laboring slaves and indentured servants, though some indentured too were driven south in the wake of abolition. The sea here operated in the imaginary as surface on which personal, nation-state, and indeed imperial interests got to be imposed. The weather was one of the elements of the natural conditions that needed to be, well, you could say, weathered in the passage, part of the adventure, challenge, or threat of raw survival. Climate also cured, from social ills to asthma and other diseases. Fixed seasonally, climates were to be favored or endued, asset or liability. Post-colonial migration, by contrast to this colonial migration that I'm pointing to, turned face, global south to global north, seeking employment and educational opportunity, sustained life projects, recall that windrush, an apposite metaphor for the then to come. Interestingly, there is a small but notable wave of retiree migration from global north to south today, overwhelmingly white, seeking a cheaper, more unplugged sunset, la pura vida, making dollars, euros, and pounds go further in the face of deteriorating economic conditions and more challenged retirement accounts at home. So this has now given way with the space-time compressions of globalization to hasten movement and diminished inhibition. So there is no exactly privileged direction, with far more voluminous comings and goings, going and working, and perhaps resting. Gabriel Josipovici wrote a wonderful essay actually about Jews called Going and Resting, where he argued that that Jews historically have always upped and, I mean, migrants, if ever there were, right, have always upped and gone. Israel has just been one more place where they've rested before they'll up and go again. I mean, he's wishful thinking perhaps at this moment in time. But, you know, maybe it presages hope for the future, right? I guess I can say it. So there's no exactly privileged direction with far more voluminous comings and goings, going and working, and perhaps resting before moving on again. Stays are tending to become less permanent, less lifelong, so much as intermittent, eventful, lasting only as long as the next luring opportunity. The greater volume is perhaps between poor parts of the world and the wealthier seeking service work or small-scale trade. And I mean, there are many, many examples, right, of Filipino domestic labor going exactly to the likes of Israel or the Middle East more generally. You know, can you guess where this is? I mean, this is a really, really curious set of images. Any idea? Any guesses?
Italy.
No. Could be, but it's not.
Mexico.
No. Israel.
Wow.
Right? So the police were sent by the state in order to pick up Ethiopian, Sudanese migrant labor, right? I mean, what is interesting is the way in which Kenyan and East African sort of labor, kind of migrant labor, ends up in a place like Israel and are being fed by local charities to some degree. It has increasingly become climatologically indexed. Weather patterns produce more violent effects. Everyone in the wake is made to march, if often and variously temporarily. The wealthy, of course, are able more readily to return and rebuild, to leave behind heightened securitization of property as they flee, and to use the moment to purge place of supposedly undesirable elements. You can think here of post-Katrina New Orleans. This actually is an interesting image as well. These are South African women married to Nigerian men protesting the South African state treatment of their husbands, right? I mean, the discriminatory treatment. So you can see the complexities of the politics that are produced out, you know, at the interface of these sort of migratory movements and so on. This is a case of Blackwater, the group that was born really in the cauldron of Iraq that provided, you know, securitization for American diplomats and so on, brought back to New Orleans in the wake of Katrina in order to police it, right? And to empty it out of people of color, exactly. The upshot is that we have gone from stable social conditions to the vulnerable, and the vulnerability of the conditions place those with less means predictably at greater risk of permanent loss than those with means. It likely means that the vulnerable move more readily seeking opportunity wherever it might eventuate. Migrant workers from the Philippines, Sri Lanka, or Romania showing up in the Middle East. But domestic and factory labor from Indonesia can just as readily be found in significant numbers in Hong Kong. I stumbled across this. I was at a workshop in Kowloon in Hong Kong, and we were walking from the mall across above the metro on a Sunday at lunchtime. And Indonesian migrant labor, right, on their one day off sort of show up in order to consort with each other, Muslim and non-Muslim, almost overwhelmingly women. There were very few men, although a couple, in order to picnic and bring their lunch and sit really in what is a traffic throughway, right? It was very, very striking. Just as we have just-in-time production and print on demand then, so too we are seeing labor on demand, ordered as needed, denuded in the social support systems such as healthcare to drive up the costs. Mexican migrant day labor standing at shopping malls up and down the 405 in sunny Southern California early in the day, awaiting to be picked up by casual day-at-a-time employers, are another of today's experiments in living and working at the margins. The kind of shadow people. Sort of, this is a very, very common sight at almost every shopping mall up and down the 405 from LA down to San Diego. Americans make up 5 to 6% of the world population, but produce fully 40% of global waste and nearly as much in pollution. The wealthier consume more and therefore also discard more. Replaceable culture is at once the culture of the discard. If one can afford it, why fix when the new, the next best or bigger or faster or design-appealing thing is so much sexier and priced for affordability, just for affordability and replaceability? In low-end stores in disprivileged parts of town, cheap plastic shopping bags are readily discarded because not usable more than once, and hence are less likely to be convenient garbage or recycle bins close to hand. The bags float about streets as likely to end up against a fence as in the garbage disposal. In the ocean, as on the beach, right? So this is, I mean, the talk before we had in Kiribati, we had a version of this. And then just to sort of skip ahead, I mean, this is the size of Australia, effectively, right? Which is plastic gathered in the Pacific Ocean, and there are two of them, right? So, I mean, the way in which discardable plastic is really beginning to clog up the ocean has become really, really dramatic. This augurs the logic of unsustainability. It wasn't so long ago that resource reproduction outstripped resource depletion. We were renewing resources faster than using them or destroying them. Then about a half century ago or so, resource depletion started outstripping, and increasingly so, resource renewal. I'm just going to skip ahead. David Rockefeller, scion of the Rockefeller family, actually created a catamaran out of plastics and sailed from San Francisco to Sydney, Australia, on a boat created out of plastic in order to bring attention to this fact. Today, however, there's been another dramatic turn. A qualitative rather than a quantitative develop in resource management. No longer is it merely the case that depletion is outstripping reproduction. Rather, the natural infrastructure and conditions that make resource reproduction even possible are now being undermined. It's not just that the rate of reproducibility is dangerously debilitating. It is now that the conditions of possibility for reproducibility themselves are being undermined. And those eroding conditions of possibility further exacerbate existing climatological conditions in ways destined to heighten the challenges. When I was growing up, the Kalahari Desert, for example, was growing at a couple of inches a year, a few more centimeters a year. It's currently 8% of the landmass of Africa, right? And in the next 50 years, the prediction is that it's going to double that percentage of the African area, or the area of the continent of Africa, right? So you can see the way in which these impacts are becoming quite dramatic. I mean, right, this gives one a sort of sense of the desertification, soil degradation, deforestation, and so on of various parts of the world. James Joyce, thinking of something else, writes in Ulysses of the snot green and scrotum tightening sea, striking characterizations in the wake of what we are experiencing today. To bring the effects, you might say, gobsmackingly home, the first interdisciplinary international report of the state of the ocean recently noted that if we take together global warming, pollution, acidification, overfishing, and hypoxia and anoxia, low and no oxygen, ocean degeneration is occurring much more quickly than any previous prediction. Massive and accelerating extinctions, all coral could be gone by 2050, and I mean, on fairly basic assumptions, right? Oceanic dead zones, the Gulf of Mexico dead zone will be the largest it has ever been due to Mississippi runoff bringing massive amounts of fertilizer into a fragile ecosystem. So you see the dead zone sort of running along the Gulf of Mexico, right? As the Mississippi River flowing across a couple of thousand miles out into the Gulf of Mexico suggests, those producing sea pollution are mostly at a remove from the sea. The sources of pollution are at a remove from their visible effect. Somebody was making reference to this earlier today. Right? Just as drones make war impersonal and so irresistible, because failing to witness their effects directly, face to face. So pollution, you could say, at a remove fails to be seen as consequential. If I can't see it, it must not exist. You could call this the return of Moorian common sense a century on, right? I mean, that sense of, yeah, I can see my hand before me, well, I can't see it, so it ain't there. Sorry, I've lost my place. The sort of reductive empiricism and denial that constitutes the so-called logic of global warming and climate change deniers like James Inhofe, the US Senator from Oklahoma, and other politicians blind to the impacts of their own legislative action or inaction, and maybe the corrupt politician or the activist, the woman that I think you referred to earlier on, right? I mean, there's an interesting, I mean, as you say, pay attention to the way in which they're thinking about these things, but also pay attention to the impact it's having on the sea and its contents. The upshot of all of this, we all live by the sea, even those who do not. We are all impacted by their climatological effects. They're shifting, call them moods, increasingly angry as they warm up. Too few know this, living at the seaside or afar. How many, even living at the sea, do more in and with the sea than look at its view and eat its source of mercurized protein? When we ask in the banalities of our daily greetings about the weather, we are in fact also asking about the state of the sea. And I have been suggesting we are also registering concern about what the sea may be hiding, its secrets and secreting, the scavengers not just within, but skating across, the cultural currencies out to pollute the pristine nature of our own. The returns of nature, in this case the sea, about which Beckett's endgame is so harrowing, remain hidden in plain sight. Neoliberally, we have to be bribed to attend to them, as Ham must bribe Nag to listen to his tale, to think there is something in it for ourselves. The trouble is that the instrumentalizing and self-interested bribes of capital and its supporting forces to remain inattentive and silent far outweigh those to attend and act or refrain from acting appropriately, as much about migration as about the devastating of our deeply networked environments. That devastating is at once about states not acting in concert, but out of, you say, self-interest. I mean, particular kinds of states especially, right? Seasickness, then, is as much a condition of the sea, of our larger planetary ecology, as of those at some point are migrating by its means. But increasingly, seasickness has become more generally experienced, a virus, perhaps one attacking the immune system. It is as applicable inland on the plains and high ground as at the coast, desert and mountainside as waterside and sea level, as Robinson himself intimates. In seeking to flee high ground for high seas, static location to migrating process, constraints of the local to the affordances of the global, containers to networks, we take the worlds we have fashioned and the environmental ecologies with us. There's a curious oversight in all of this. There is a curious oversight in all of this as we tend to think of migration in terms of sending site and immediately visible causes and receiving destination and immediately obvious impacts. What of the in-between, the materialities of getting from there to here or to there, the agency, effect, and affect of that in-betweenness on the transitional life, on the life of transition itself. The transitional life that has become increasingly the mark of the life of work, procuring possibility at all now. The prevailing, maybe I'll skip that. How then to think about the implications of all this for racial migrations, which might be to say migration as such. So we turn to sort of questions of relationality. Consider Charles Olson's claim in his 1947 book about Moby Dick that there are three seas, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and as he puts it now, the Pacific. I mean, interesting that he would name those three, right? In this parochial extended Euro-provincialism, there is, of course, here the invisibilizing of the Indian Ocean. Once more, the refusal of the East, the occlusion even of, call it the Orient, and so profound, you could say, deorientation. This begins to suggest that oceans, the world ocean, have unique character. These characters are likewise shaped by the landscapes at their edges as they lap on and over land. The character is a function of how it is taken to behave, its projected agency, but also as a reflection of the land masses and the perceived nature of their populations it connects, between which it mediates. The one a presumed mirror of the implication of its sea source. The Indian Ocean is projected as warm but prone to violent eruptions, interventions, events. The Pacific is supposedly a reflection of its name, majestic, inviting recreationality, but also conjuring the opacity and scrutability of its rimming land bases, South Asian and East African. The Atlantic, cold, wild, dangerous, is bounded by the global northeastern Latin America, the Caribbean and North America. Hence, one might say, also the Black Atlantic. The Atlantic and Indian meet. So just to go back to this slide, I mean, this is almost looks like a tsunami, right? It's a place called Teahupoo in Tahiti, which has become the go-to place for extreme surfing, right? I mean, and the water literally sucks up almost dry off the reef, and the guys are surfing, 7, 8, 9, 10 meter waves sort of in this environment on almost bare coral reef. I mean, it's quite extraordinary to watch. Moving to the Black Atlantic. The Atlantic and Indian meet at Africa's most southern point, just as the Atlantic and Pacific meet at Latin America's points of coastal wildness and wilderness, both. The metaphor for mixture, for mongrelization, the Atlantic perhaps polluting the character of its pairings. The aesthetic analogy, you might say, Alcester painting. I could say a good deal more about that, but don't have the time. The Indian and Pacific have no landed meeting point, blending rather indistinguishably into each other, reflecting their relative porousness colonially and post-colonially. The Black Atlantic is often, the Black Atlantic is often thought the outer condition, at once its constitutive outside of the Atlantic. And this is often how it is addressed, taken up, the Atlantic's underside. But the point could be pushed that the Atlantic is constitutively the Black Atlantic. The Black Atlantic, nothing less than the Atlantic as such. That Atlantic Europe, in fact, marks a margin of the Atlantic. It's provincialized, and by extension, it's provincializing determination. Not its center, not its crown. Destination rather than emanating point. Receptacle rather than fountain. Weather-wise, Europe, continental and Icelandic, is the dumping ground of the Atlantic's wrath. Excuse the expression, it's piss pot. The sea, could be said, is variously source of labor, life and the recreational. It is not that most now experience the sea only through the commodities brought in the hulls of ships, as Tausig puts it, but more mediatedly through cultural expressions. I mean, there are all kinds of cultural expressions we can point to. The sea itself has become commodified in a wide variety of ways, imaginatively enlarged through its cultural enablement and prostheses, while incorporating the prevailing semantic stereotypes. In contrast to the examples, in thinking about the sea-ness of the sea, considered to some degree something like Le Crabe Tambour, just going to skip ahead. Peter Schoendorfer's marvelous 1977 movie, which really does get something about the sea-ness of the sea, and I highly recommend it, actually watching it if you want to get at a representation of in a sense, sea-ness, for want of a better word. So let me just, in the interest of time, skip ahead a bit. Today, that sense of temporal transporting is less readily available. The crossings tend to be more fraught, in smaller, older vessels, sardine-packed, often open to the elements, barely above the waterline, creaking across straits and sea crossings, North Africa to Southern Europe, Caribbean or Central America to the US, Indonesia to more or less mainland Asia, and so on. Or risking life alternatively, packed into cargo containers, reduced, I mean, you get a sense of the fraughtness through these sorts of images, right? Reduced to commodities. The wealthier, luring or alluring destinations tend to be those elevated on the racial scale, respecting the lives only or largely of the racial and or class equals. The migrants from sites historically identified as racially challenged are extended raciality by their hosts, filling them into existing racial schema, perhaps modestly revised, consistent with contemporary racial expectation and conceptualization in the metropole. In any case, recent changes in Australian law signal a new racially indexed logic. Even though international norms and law recognize that those arriving by boat are more likely to be, quote-unquote, genuine refugees from repression, in contrast to more self-serving air travelers, Australian law now determines how one arrives at the border is more important than where one arrives. How one arrives at the border is more important than where one arrives. Boat arrivals are shorn of rights that air travelers are taken to have. Race is indexed in the mode of travel while foregoing the need for explicit racial reference, now regarded as unbecoming to governmental practice. I'm nearly done. Post-raciality is a prevailing conception regarding race in the metropole today. Right, there's a return of this sort of sensibility, right? I end accordingly by asking what the relation, if any, between migrancy and post-raciality. If the post in the post-racial is to the racial, as the post in the post-colonial is to the colonial, namely different or renewed ways of race and coloniality, respectively ordering and fashioning the global, of how raciality and coloniality contemporarily are lived and lived out, then post-raciality also makes for the disappearance of the racial by removing its language of referentiality. And so the affective becomes important, right, as a dimension of abstracting definition. Regions more vulnerable to coastal flooding or storm surges, to more violent weather events and higher seas, to mudslides and political ignoring in their aftermath, are those that tend overwhelmingly to be inhabited by the traditionally conceived racial poor. It will be interesting to see going forward whether coastal dwellers, no matter wealthy or not, right, get turned into racially conceived subjects, right, as a consequence of the effects of environmental impact. I mean, I'll pose that as a question rather than make it as a claim. They are far less well prepared for environmental disasters as a result of climatological events. And I mean, storms like Sandy and others sort of indicate that, you know, even the better off are less well prepared, kind of living in those conditions. More likely to be permanently displaced, and as a consequence, also to be criminalized. In disappearing, race, you could say, reappears under other less recognizable terms of reference. Migration is thought to have no racial dimension today because the terms of recognition, of identification, of reference itself have been made to disappear. I mean, that's the post-racial condition, right? And I've written separately about post-raciality in these terms. But as the terms of characterization fade to the point of transparency and the phenomena become unrecognizable in those terms, if not in themselves as such, resort to the public sphere, large-scale demonstrations in central public areas of major cities, social media, etc., become increasingly insistent and persistent, and break out, you could say, where least expected. Their raciality becomes enigmatically self-evident in its non-referentiality. I mean, there's an enigmatic feature or condition or character to this. Reality has long been known for its capacity to morph, to assume terms other than the predictable. Where migrations are thought to no racial dimension, let alone definition, the terms of the racial reappear, become insistent, persistent, while shed of their referentiality. And this in the wake of Katrina. Where fear eating the soul 25 years ago was Ali's, today it is, you could say, Alan's or Elaine's or Alphonse's or Alex or Alexi's. That shift in fear that we were referencing a bit earlier as well, that shift not least is linked to the changing face and fact, function and presumptuous familiarity of migration. It's now silently, more silent, but not silenced racial dimension. The fear of the racially characterized migrant, last paragraph, is at once the fear of a planet perceived to be climatologically out of control, and the fear of a planet climatologically run amok, the fear of racial invasion. Melancholia, yeah, I mean that Lars von Trier kind of melancholia, is nostalgia for this lost control, a recall for a world resettled racially and predictable climatologically. But as with melancholia more generally, it is for an object in both instances permanently and interactively lost and at a loss. And in both instances, alas, it is unlikely to rest in peace. So I'll end just there with an enigmatic sculpture. Thank you.